Hello and a big warm welcome to this presentation from the Urban Penguin. My name is Andrew Mallard and yes, I am the Urban Penguin. I've got the t-shirt to prove it. Now today we're going to go through to our Linux command line and take a look at creating mount points. Now mount points, you say, are just going to be directories, but yes, you are correct from that point of view. But we want to make sure we know the correct way of setting permissions when creating our mount points. We don't want to set the permissions when we create the mount point. We want to make sure we're setting the permissions once the mount point is created. Come on, let's go through and look at this common problem. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the command line. We're using Ubuntu Linux here, but this would be working in pretty much any Linux distribution. Now, I'm working as a standard user, and that is going to be okay. And obviously, I can use sudo to run some of the commands that I want. But there are further shortcuts to me if I can open up a shell as a root user. So let's go through and do a sudo -i. That gives me the interactive shell. If I look at the ID command, of course I'm going to be root. We understand that. But also look at my group ownership, the group ID. Now that's then going to affect any resource that I create. So if I want a directory that is going to be private to a group, so it's accessible by a group but not by others, I want to make sure that it's correctly owned by the group. So one way of doing that, of course, as a bit of a shortcut, is to just switch to the group. So if I switch, let's say, to the sudo group, I'm using a very basic setup here, so I don't have any real additional groups that I've created. So we can go through and make out that we want to share a directory through to the sudo group. If I switch to the sudo group, as root, we can switch to any group. And look what that's done with my ID command. It's now the group ID is sudo. So if I go through and create a directory, mukdir, and then we can call it /shared or whatever we want to call it. It is going to be group owned by the sudo group. If I want to set the permissions of this, I can go through and specify the mode. And we can go through and set our mode to be read, write, and executable to the user, read, write, and executable to the group, and then no permissions to others. I've not finished yet, so don't hit the enter key. When I move back, we have got our special permissions. If we put 3 here, we're setting the group ID bit on the directory, which would have a value of 2, and we're setting the sticky bit. The group ID bit on the directory means that all new files created in the directory are going to be group owned by the group owner of the directory. Setting the sticky bit on the directory ensures that we can only delete files that we own. Obviously, we've got the right permission through the sudo group of being able to write to this directory, which means that we can delete. To ensure we only delete our own files, we set the sticky bit. If I now go through and list the permissions of this directory, ls -ld, and I can use escape and dot to bring up the last argument, when we take a look at this now, we can see that everything looks pretty good. We've got the right permissions. It's not accessible by others. And when we go through and take a look at it, we've got the sticky bit being an uppercase T, showing that execute is not set. And we've got the S in our group permissions, indicating that we've got the set group ID bit. So all of this looks great and is going to work perfectly well. If I go back as my standard user, so we exit out of the first shell, that takes me back still as root because we're exiting out of the environment for switch group. We exit again, it takes me back to my vagrant user, check the ID. The ID at the moment is showing that I don't belong to the sudo group. Well, if it's going to be then shared to the sudo group, I need access. But let's test first. If I try and access the shared directory, permission is denied, so I don't have access. So everything is working the way that we want. If I go through and do a sudo user mod -append to my groups and adding in then the sudo group through to my wonderful user vagrant, hit the big drums And now we should be a member of the Vagrant group. Let's go through and do the ID command. Oh, it doesn't show, does it? No, because we have to log out and log in again. So we can do a Control D. I can up arrow key, away we go. I'm just using Vagrant as my virtual machine manager here. So that's where I'm using Vagrant SSH, and then clear my screen, run the ID command. This all now looks pretty good. Can I access the directory? And when I go through, I can. Look what happens when I touch a new file. So touch file 1, ls-ld, or -l, I don't need the D. When we look at file 1, look at the group ownership. It's owned by the sudo group. So that's then our group ID bit all working. Now then, of course, we might think, well, hang on, I thought you were telling me how we should be setting our permissions. This looks like a really great way to set our permissions. Well, it is for a standard directory, but it's not necessarily going to be the best way if we want to create a mount point. We might think we're doing the right thing by doing all of these clever things, setting up our permissions, but they are not correct. We're setting the permissions on the /shared directories. For a mount point, we really need to be setting the permissions on the root file of the imported file system. Let me show you. It will become much more clear when we take a look at it. So back on my command line, if I go through and just look up my block devices, so ls block, I've got a second disk here. I don't have any partitions on this at the moment. Let's quickly create ourselves a partition. So we, of course, need to create a partition table on that disk. So I'm going to use sudo and fdisk. Now, of course, we need then to partition that disk and add a file system. So we're going to use sudo and fdisk /dev/sdb. Make sure we're working with the correct disk device. It adds in the partition table, and then I can go through and create a new partition, a primary partition, partition number 1, starting at the beginning of the disk, sector 2048, and then I can choose the last sector. I just want the 1 partition, so I can hit enter. I can print, so I can check then it looks okay, and when I'm ready I can hit W to write, and then that saves the partition table, and of course exit. Control and L allows me then to go through and clear the screen, and I can go through and list the block devices, and we can see now that I've got my 10 meg disk. It's a tiny disk. But on that, we've got then a 9 meg partition. If we want to create a file system on this, we can go through. It's a very small disk, so I don't need to worry too much about anything too great. But let's go through, and on that, let's create muckfs. We'll just keep it very simple, ext2, and then /dev/sdb1. Now, of course, permission is denied, but that allows me to show you that we can repeat the last command with sudo. I did forget, but never mind. It is a great shortcut. So we've now created our file system. Now, so I've got a very small file system here, so that's really why I'm using ext2. However, it doesn't change anything. If I move out of my shared directory, where we want to show that the mount point we've created with our permissions has all been a waste of time and actually quite dangerous, if I go through and take a look, doing a sudo and mount sdb1 into the shared directory, and then look at the permissions, ls-ld, on the shared directory, all of our permissions seem to have disappeared. As we add in the file system, the file system then becomes the shared directory. If I unmount it, and then take a look at the shared directory again, we're back to the permissions that we think we should have. And I say these are the wrong permissions for the mount point, because it means then that I can access the directory when the file system's not mounted. Now that gives us an opportunity for a user to add a file whilst the file system's in maintenance, and then think the file has disappeared when we fix it later, where we add the file system back. So we really don't want our users to have access to it whilst the file system is not mounted. So our correct permissions for the mount point, let's go through and look at sudo chmod, and then 0/shared. We don't want any permissions on the shared directory. And that still means that root can access it. When we look at it, we probably have been left with some residual permissions. Let's go through and take a look at the /shared directory, and we can see the group ID bit is still set. It won't make a lot of difference, but we can go through and remove that as well. So I can go through and do a group -s. So we should be good to go. We can prove now that it's not working. So if I try now and access the /shared directory, permission is denied. So whilst the file system is not mounted, users should not be able to enter the directory. They can't then put files in the directory by mistake. Once it is mounted, let's go through and mount this again. Once it is mounted, it's from here that we go through and set our permissions. So we can go through and do a sudo chmod 3770 for the shared directory. Got to set the ownership as well. So let's go through and make sure then that it is owned by the correct group. So let's set this up for the sudo group. Let's take a look at those permissions. So ls-ld on the shared directory. Drum roll, please. Look at this. Everything now looks correct. Whilst the file system is mounted, our users can then go through and touch file 1. So that's all good. ls-l on file 1. We can see the permissions are correct, so vagrant and sudo, so everything is working. Again, go through and unmount it. So I'm just going to do a Control-R and to recall the unmount command. Try and list then the shared directory as a standard user. I now don't have access. But of course, everything is still there. One more time, just so we do understand this. Let's go through and mount this again. Then as we go through and look inside of our shared directory, look at that. Everything is back the way that we want. So I do really like the idea of using shortcuts, and it might seem the right thing to do when creating a mount point to set the permissions and ownership as quickly and as correctly as possible. However, hopefully as we understand now, when we set the mount point, the permissions should be 0. Root can access it, but then nobody else. Mount the file system. Once we've mounted our file system, we can then go through and make sure that everything is correct as far as the permission is concerned by setting it on the root file system of our mounted device.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.